Jews were craving for a homeland as anti-Semitism was at its peak. Although some notable Jews had come up with the idea of a United States for Jews, the idea flourished when renowned journalist and political activist Theodor Herzl formed the World Zionist Organization, aimed at creating a Jewish state in Palestine. Palestine at the time was under Ottoman rule. Leader of the Zionist movement, Herzl offered the Sultan to pay the foreign and provide propaganda for the Ottoman Sultan in Europe in exchange for Jewish settlement and governance in the area. The Sultan declined the offer. Following the First World War, Palestine fell to the British, which then announced its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people through the Balfour Declaration. In 1947, following World War II and the Holocaust, the British government announced its desire to terminate the mandate, followed by the General Assembly of the United Nations adopting Resolution 181, recommending partition into an Arab state, a Jewish state, and the city of Jerusalem. After the announcement of the UN resolution to partition the state, clashes erupted almost immediately between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. As Israel declared its independence, Arab countries from across the region waged war on the newly formed nation. Despite Arabs attacking from multiple directions, Israel successfully repelled repeated Arab attacks, winning control of the main road to Jerusalem through the Judean mountains. Arabs occupied the areas in southern and eastern Palestine, which were not apportioned to the Jews by the UN. Relations with their neighbors continued to deteriorate, besides fighting several wars with their neighbors in the remaining century, proving their military and technological might on a global scale, where Israel captured Gaza, West Bank, and Golan Heights. Despite this, Israel had tremendous support from the United States. The consequences of these constant wars were animosity and hatred that grew between the communities, which would pave the way for injustice, political exclusion, and denial of human rights for the Palestinian people towards the upcoming decade. Occupied Palestinian territory. Palestinian regions occupied by Israel in 1967 are accepted as occupied territories and illegal settlements under international law. Within the international community, the overwhelming view is that Article 49 of the Geneva Convention applies to the occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. Israel to this day continues to build Jewish settlements across the annexed region. Former Prime Minister Netanyahu had vowed to carry out and formalize the systematic Israeli suppression and domination over the Palestinians under the curtain of the so-called peace process. Racism. Thousands of families have to face eviction from their homes due to Israel's illegal settlement programs based on their ethnicity, while leading Israeli officials make clear that the objective of maintaining Jewish Israeli control over demographic, political power, and land has long guided government policy. In pursuit of this goal, authorities have stripped, enclosed, forcibly secluded, and suppressed Palestinians due to their identity to varying degrees of intensity. For the past 54 years, Israeli authorities have facilitated the transfer of Jewish Israelis, granting them a superior status under the law compared to Palestinians living in the same territory when it comes to civil rights. Gaza. Gaza is described by many as the largest open-air prison where 1.94 million Palestinians live behind a blockade and are refused access to other occupied Palestinian areas and the rest of the world. Needs 6 million or 84% of the population in Gaza needs humanitarian aid. 98% of the water in Gaza is contaminated and undrinkable. Gaza has beautiful beaches, but every day 90 million liters of unfiltered seaweed is pumped out along the shoreline. The Gazan population cannot count on more than 2 to 4 hours of continuous electrical power a day. Every day, Gaza experiences up to 22 hours of a power outage. 35% of land eligible for farming is unavailable, and fishermen are blocked from 85% of the waters on the Israeli coast of Gaza due to Israeli security zones. 45% are refused specialized medical treatment outside Gaza. Israeli military courts have been trying Palestinians in the territory since the occupation began. The courts offer an illusion of proper judicial conduct. The Palestinians are always either suspects or defendants and convicted for violating orders issued by the occupation regime. As such, these courts cannot be impartial, neutral, or arbitrator. They are firmly entrenched on the Israeli side of the power imbalance and serve as the central systems maintaining control over the Palestinian people. Israel has killed thousands of Palestinians in the occupied territories over the years, seemingly acting under the limitations of the military's open fire regulation. But this is no more than a pretense of legality, with backing from the government, the courts, and the military. This policy reflects the disregard for Palestinian lives and property. Apartheid. The 1998 Rome Statute to the International Criminal Code and 1973 International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of Crime of Apartheid define apartheid as a crime against humanity consisting of 3 main elements: an intent to maintain domination by one racial group over another, a context of systematic oppression by one racial group over another. Inhumane acts. These acts are done by the Israeli regime to Palestinians on a regular basis. Control over land. Israeli authorities have sought to ensure Jewish control over the land and natural resources in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. Israeli authorities strive to maximize the land available for Jewish communities and largely confine Palestinians to dense population centers. Forced evictions. Israel demolished 848 Palestinian residential and livelihood structures in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, displacing 996 people, according to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Israeli authorities said many demolished buildings lacked Israeli-issued permits, which are virtually impossible for Palestinians to obtain, or were in closed military zones. The law of occupation prohibits such destruction unless necessary for military operations. Arbitrary detention. Israeli authorities conduct hundreds of raids throughout the West Bank to arrest Palestinians, usually at their homes at night. Those arrested are detained in prisons in Israel, along with thousands of other Palestinians from the occupied Palestinian territory detained in previous years. This violates international humanitarian law, which prohibits the transfer of detainees into the territory of the occupying power. Israeli narrative. The real reason for the continuation of the conflict was the refusal of the Arab states to recognize Israel's existence. Israel has repeatedly offered peace, but not at the price of the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state, which has been the Arab goal since 1948. The settlements are not in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, since in its view, Israeli citizens were neither deported nor transferred to the territories, and they cannot be considered as occupied territory, since there had been no internationally recognized legal sovereign prior. The Israeli decision to prevent refugees from returning was justified, as otherwise Israel would be destroyed by a hostile Arab internal majority. Government-backed Jewish settlers causing havoc on Palestinian regions were becoming normal, as Israel's government wanted to exert power on the Palestinian communities as never before. Settlers vandalizing and torching cars had become a common sight. Tensions between Israeli police and Palestinians began flaring on 12 April when Israeli police put up blockades preventing Palestinians from gathering. Later on 16 April, Israel imposed a 10,000-person limit on prayers at Al-Aqsa Mosque, turning away thousands of Palestinians. The key trigger for the recent unrest was a legal dispute, as Jewish settlers were trying to evict Palestinians from their homes using coercive methods. The Israeli authorities had given permission to the Jerusalem Day March, traditionally taken out by far-right Zionists through the Arab quarter of the Old City. Ahead of the march on May 10, Israeli armed forces stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque with rubber bullets, stun grenades and tear gas to evict Palestinians, leaving more than 300 injured, which Israel said had camped with stones and Molotov cocktails. Following this terrorizing attack, Hamas gave an ultimatum to Israeli forces to withdraw from the Jerusalem compound, firing dozens of rockets at Israel from Gaza after the passing of its ultimatum. Israel retaliated by its largest offensive in the last 30 years after it struck back with its air force on the besieged Gaza, killing at least 230 people, including 65 children and injuring 1,710 people. Hamas and Israel agreed to a ceasefire after more than 10 days of fighting that has taken hundreds of lives. Earlier this month, the Jerusalem municipality issued a series of demolition orders to residents of the Al-Bustan area in Silwan. The families affected, consisting of the 1,500 people, were given 21 days to evacuate and demolish their houses themselves. Failure to do so would mean the municipality will demolish the houses and the families would have to cover the demolition cost. Ultra-nationalist, far-right politician Naftali Bennett has been elected as the new Prime Minister of Israel. He has long championed the right of Jewish settlement in the West Bank. He was once the head of the Yisha Council, the political representative group for Jewish settlers. Jerusalem Flag March was held under ramped-up security as thousands of right-wing nationalists marched through parts of Jerusalem's old city, chanting the racist "Death to Arab" slogan. While the United Nations Security Council and its member states were calling for a ceasefire during the Israeli offensive, the US repeatedly blocked UN statements that condemned Israel's military response and called for a ceasefire. A country that possesses diplomatic power like the US should have tried to implement peace in the region rather than serving Israel's interests, while the US policy on the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands has been lopsided, making it challenging to resolve the root cause of the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians. Israel still receives yearly military aid from the US, despite committing all sorts of crimes on almost a daily basis. Ignoring the plight of Palestinians is a stain on both the democracies. Israel's regular oppression of the Palestinian people and denying them the most basic of rights that must be given to its people by a democratic country, while the media tries its best to portray them as terrorists for defending their lives, families, and properties, while Israel systematically cleanses Palestinians from their own ancestral homeland is shameful and utterly disgusting to humanity.